primary accounts of Accumulate are Accumulate Digital Identifiers, or ADIs. ADIs are a fifth-generation identity framework and a greatly enhanced version of the W3C definition of a decentralized digital identifier. To put the novelty of ADIs into perspective, it's good to review the previous generation identity frameworks and talk about their limitations as human society and technology advanced. You might consider the first generation identity framework to be carbon identities, which early humans developed in prehistoric times to establish trust between individuals and communities before the convenience of written language. Validation of identity was likely based on simple greetings, style of dress, and other types of audio or visual cues that are still used in our culture today and possibly even hardwired into our DNA. However, carbon identities aren't very secure, and visual cues aren't that reliable in larger, more diverse communities. Physical or analog identities would be a second-generation identity framework. These leverage the ability to write data into documents in order to define membership and roles. Physical documents like credit cards, photo ID, and handwritten signatures may be used to validate your identity and authorize someone to make a transaction. Analog identity improves upon carbon identity by adding a physical token that's universally accepted by members of the community, making it much more scalable. Complicated security features like holograms and superfine print also make it much harder to forge documents. But it is possible to buy these tools, which is why it's becoming a lot more common to require both physical identity and presence, like when a customer shows ID in person when buying alcohol. However, third parties who validate presence can be unreliable, and despite all these security features, the majority of identity theft today still involves analog identity. When the internet was invented, we saw the creation of electronic security in the form of passwords, MAC addresses, IP addresses, and digital accounts that are usually secured using passwords, cryptography, and multi-factor authentication. These represent the third-generation identity framework that we can call centralized digital identities because they depend on central authorities for the issuance, security, and validation of identity. Unlike analog identity, digital ID does not need to be physically present on the individual when they're making a transaction. Instead, you can distribute your credentials anywhere in the world, which led to the development of entirely new industries like online commerce. You can also combine digital and analog identity to make your security even stronger. For example, you might want to combine RFID chips and multi-factor authentication to validate physical ownership and transmit data at the same time. However, the main drawbacks are that a person has no control over their identity, and a party controlling their data can lose it if they're hacked or go bankrupt. In 2014, for example, 1 billion people had their personal information exposed after the Yahoo data breach. In 2017, the records of 147 million Americans were exposed during a similar data breach at Equifax. But with the invention of blockchain technology, we saw a major push to give people control of their identity, which led to the creation of a fourth-generation identity framework called a Decentralized Digital Identifier, or DDI. Within a DDI framework, your identity on the blockchain is defined by knowing a passphrase that can be validated by a script. This passphrase is typically the private key of a public-private key pair, and is much more secure than a password because you don't need to expose your private key when you're signing a transaction. Minimizing the exposure of your private key and securing that key behind powerful cryptography is a major benefit of DDIs. The problem is that their flexibility is quite limited. If you lose your keys, for example, you need to make a whole new identity. What Accumulate built is a fifth-generation identity framework that allows people to organize their digital identities into hierarchies and replicate almost any organizational structure. Every identity within that structure can have a hierarchy of keys, which allows your organization to make and modify arbitrarily complex authorization schemes and replicate virtually any financial operation. The idea is to remake existing applications that exist in a Web 2 ecosystem and give them Web 3 functionality in terms of decentralization, transparency, interoperability, and individual ownership of content. In Accumulate, we can easily integrate our identities into mobile and web-based applications because our Accumulate Digital Identifiers, or ADIs, conform to W3C standards for decentralized digital identities. This means they are globally unique, cryptographically verifiable, and similar to URLs in their architecture despite working like a typical blockchain address. One example of a URL is acc:/bank, where ACC is a prefix that tells you it's an accumulate identity, and bank is the ADI. Within your ADI, you can have ADI token accounts, ADI data accounts, and also other types of accounts you can read more about in the white paper. For example, an ADI bank can have token accounts for things like loans, securities, or real estate, and you can even add directories like D or T to indicate account type and to help you organize your accounts. You can also have any number of sub-ADIs underneath your ADI. This means you can have a sub-ADI of a sub-ADI of a sub-ADI, and so on. Taking the example of a bank, you could have sub-ADIs for the auditing department, the director within that department, the manager of a particular branch, and also the employees within that branch. In this way, you can replicate almost any corporate structure. But the engine behind all of this is Accumulate's unique hierarchy of prioritized keys, which allows an ADI to essentially recover lost keys, to modify its security, to add or remove other ADIs as signers on multi-sig transactions, to assign automated managers to your ADI, or to delegate authority over your accounts to other ADIs. Authorization schemes, managers, and delegates are going to be covered in future videos, but for now it's important to understand that ADIs provide a new identity framework that builds upon fourth-generation identity frameworks and makes it much easier for blockchain to replicate and integrate with Web 2 infrastructure to enable the creation of powerful, flexible, and user-friendly Web 3 applications.